What if the fight for your home wasn't against time or decay, but against the very people who claim to protect it? For 20 years, I lived in peace under the shade of two towering oak trees older than the neighborhood itself. Then, a single letter from the HOA changed everything. They wanted control. They wanted conformity. But I had a different plan. Would you stand up for what you love, even if it meant taking on an entire system? Stick around, because this is the story of how I turned my quiet suburban yard into a battleground and won. I've been living in the Sunnyvale Estates subdivision for close to 20 years when it happened. An envelope from the Homeowners Association appeared in my mailbox one Thursday afternoon. I nearly left it unopened on the kitchen counter, thinking it was just another reminder about the neighborhood chili cook-off or the upcoming community garage sale. But something about the urgent red sticker on the outside demanded attention, so I peeled it open right away. Inside was a stark, formal notice printed on HOA letterhead. Your property is in violation of community standards. You are hereby instructed to trim or remove overgrown tree limbs encroaching on common pathways. The words felt jarring. The trees in question were a pair of massive, centuries-old live oaks that stretched gracefully over my yard, providing dappled shade in summer and a mild rustling tune whenever a breeze blew through. My late wife, Clara, had loved to sit beneath those oaks with a glass of iced tea, reading novels or flipping through her well-worn crossword puzzle books. The letter ended with a deadline: trim them within 14 days or face a substantial fine. It was signed by the HOA president, a fellow named Jerry Holcomb, who'd been known around the subdivision for his strictly-by-the-book approach. Jerry was newish to the board, having moved here from somewhere up north. He was the type of man who'd remind you to move your trash bin 2 inches closer to the curb if it didn't align with guidelines. At first, I tried to keep my cool. Sure, the trees had grown dense canopies. Maybe a few limbs hung near the sidewalk. But removing them altogether, my heart pounded at the thought. Those oaks were older than most folks in Sunnyvale. They'd been the focal point of the yard since the original farmhouse stood here, long before the tract homes sprouted up. My father, a man who believed in the enduring spirit of nature, used to say each trunk contained a silent library of stories. The following morning, I called the HOA office, hoping for a polite conversation. A bored-sounding receptionist informed me I could schedule a hearing with the board next month, but that the letter's deadline wouldn't be extended unless I had valid, pressing reasons. I hung up without scheduling anything. It was clear I'd get nowhere. The next step was common sense, I supposed. I'd call an arborist, have them do a little trimming, satisfy the requirement as minimally as possible, and hope Jerry Holcomb's eagle eyes would be appeased. But a strange thing started gnawing at me that afternoon. I stood outside, gazing up at those gnarled, thick boughs. Squirrels darted in and out of the leaves, fussing over hidden acorns. A cardinal perched on a high branch, chirping away as though celebrating the end of winter. The oak was more than just a fixture to me. It was a piece of living history, one that provided shade and comfort for over a century. To drastically cut it back, turn it into a stumpy silhouette, felt like vandalizing a cherished painting. I paced the lawn, remembering every memory attached to the yard. Clara's laughter drifting across the driveway as we hosted a July 4th barbecue. My grandkids climbing the lower branches, giggling as they hung from the limbs like monkeys on a playground. Even the neighborhood cats took their afternoon naps on the huge roots that curved out of the ground. It was a microcosm of life, a quiet testament to nature's resilience amidst uniform lawns and trimmed hedges. The next day, I decided to attend the monthly HOA meeting to plead my case. I arrived 10 minutes early to find only a handful of residents, all of them older retirees. We'd normally chat about the pond or the communal tennis court. But that evening, they seemed subdued, as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. Jerry Holcomb sat at the front with 2 other board members, flipping through a stack of documents. When my turn came to speak, I explained that these oaks weren't just trees, they were cornerstones of the neighborhood. I even brought a few photos of the yard from years past, showing children, barbecues, and the general sense of community that thrived under those branches. Jerry was unimpressed. He frowned at the pictures, tapping a pen on the table. "Rules are rules," he declared, shrugging in a way that made me clench my jaw. "If we make an exception for you, we have to do it for everyone." The trees must be trimmed or removed. Simple as that. I left the meeting with my blood boiling. Neighbors who seemed sympathetic walked me to my car, but they stopped short of offering real support. "We don't want to pick a fight," said one woman timidly. "Last time someone contested an HOA directive, they got slapped with fines for everything from fence height to paint color." Driving home, I stewed in frustration. Why were we allowing a handful of bureaucrats to chip away at the vibrant character of our little corner of the world? This was Sunnyvale Estates, where folks once prided themselves on small-town friendliness and backyard gardens. Now, it felt like I was living under the watchful eye of an overzealous neighbor. Something inside me snapped. Maybe it was the accumulated grief of losing Clara, the weight of turning 70 last year, or simply the rebellious spark I never knew I had. But I decided then and there, if they wanted me to trim my trees, I'd go 2 steps further. I'd grow something so lush, so untamed, that no by-the-book standard could extinguish its life. I didn't have a grand plan yet, but the seed of defiance was planted. If the HOA insisted on micromanaging nature, I'd give them a jungle, literally. They'd soon realize that controlling nature is like trying to catch smoke in your hands. Impossible. And I'd make sure they'd have no choice but to see the beauty in letting life grow wild and free. Early the next morning, I rose before dawn and brewed a strong pot of coffee. A swirl of possibilities raced through my mind. If I was going to create a suburban jungle as a form of protest, I needed to do my homework. Not just any random plant would thrive in our climate, especially not something typically found in tropical rainforests. But certain species might adapt well enough if I gave them proper care: heat lamps, protective netting, the right soil. I spent the day driving around town, visiting gardening centers, and flipping through horticulture books in the dusty library basement. The librarian, an older gentleman named Frank, seemed both amused and intrigued when I explained my mission. He disappeared into the back room and returned with a stack of reference guides on exotic plant cultivation. Some were out of print, relics from the 1970s, but they promised a trove of knowledge about creating microclimates. Once home, I sat at my kitchen table, sipping more coffee than I probably should have, and mapping out how to transform a slice of my yard into a lush canopy. My plan began modestly. I'd introduce a few vines around the base of the oaks, as well as ground cover that mimicked the dense layering of a tropical forest floor. Over time, I'd add more dramatic elements: banana plants, bird of paradise flowers, or maybe even a small greenhouse section. I even considered building an arch trellis at the edge of the property, draped with thick creepers, to give the entryway a dramatic, jungle-like vibe. I felt an electric thrill in my chest, both from excitement and from a dash of nerves. When Clara was alive, she'd always been the calm, rational one. She'd probably shake her head at the idea of challenging authority with a miniature rainforest. But I also liked to think she might smile at how I was finally standing up for something that mattered. After her passing, I let life's little pleasures slip through my fingers. This was the first spark of true passion I'd felt in ages. The next day, I made my first purchase, a collection of exotic ferns. They weren't dramatic from a distance, just lush, green, and thick, but I knew from my reading that ferns could help create a moist environment under their canopy. If I could keep them alive through the next seasonal shift, it would encourage beneficial insects and maybe even amphibians to make a home there. Neighbors started noticing. I'd be out in the yard at odd hours, tending new soil beds, carefully weaving mesh to protect the baby ferns from direct afternoon sun. One or two would wander over, hands in their pockets, and politely ask what I was up to. I usually shrugged and said, "Oh, just trying some new plants," not wanting to attract attention from the ever-watchful Jerry Holcomb. Yet word did spread. A few curious souls even offered me old planters or leftover mulch. Mrs. Patel from down the street donated some elephant ear bulbs she'd grown indoors. Her daughter had mailed them from Florida, and they had sprouted impressively large leaves. "Might fit your project," she said with a wink. I realized that while fear of the HOA hung like a cloud, there were plenty of residents quietly cheering me on, hoping for a chance to break free from the monotony. Within a week, my entire front yard began transforming. The old flower bed near the mailbox, once a simple arrangement of daylilies and daisies, now sprouted canna lilies with tall burgundy leaves. Around the base of the oak, I spread compost mixed with peat moss, forging a fertile circle for future plantings. I ordered a few dwarf banana plant seedlings online, crossing my fingers they'd survive the shipping intact. Jerry Holcomb, meanwhile, made his presence known. One Thursday morning, while I was examining a newly arrived shipment of hibiscus starters, Jerry strolled by on his daily walk. He paused at the edge of my driveway, tapping the face of his smartwatch. "We gave you a deadline of 14 days, he said, tilting his head. "I don't see any arborist trucks out here." I grinned, deciding to test the waters of honesty. "I'm still working on that. Doing some of my own careful trimming," I replied, pointing to a few small branches I'd pruned. "Taking it slow to avoid shocking the trees." Jerry pursed his lips. "Slow might cost you. You know, fines accumulate quickly if you're not in compliance." "That's so," I replied casually. "Well, I'll be sure to keep track." He walked on, clearly suspicious of my yard's metamorphosis. I noticed how his eyes flicked toward the canna lilies, his brow furrowing in disapproval. Rather than feel intimidated, I found myself oddly amused, even emboldened. My yard was alive in a way it had never been, and I sensed a rebellious joy simmering under the surface. That evening, after a long day of planting, I sat on the porch with a glass of sweet tea, surveying the chaotic greenery. The ferns fluttered in a gentle breeze, the canna lily's leaves glowed in the setting sun, and the ancient oaks loomed overhead like silent guardians. I felt an odd kinship with them in that moment, a joint resistance against forced conformity. Clara's wind chimes jangled softly, as though whispering encouragement. A year ago, I would have balked at the idea of confronting anyone, let alone an entire HOA board. Now, though, I felt like a gardener forging new paths, maybe a bit old to be stirring up trouble, but not too old to take a stand. The stage was set, and I suspected that Jerry Holcomb's next move wouldn't be far off. A few days later, the skies turned dark. Heavy clouds gathered in the late afternoon, rumbling in the distance before releasing a torrential downpour. Rain sheeted the windows, and wind gusts shook the oak branches so fiercely I worried one might snap. Lightning lit up the yard every few seconds, illuminating the new greenery I'd planted. Despite the risk, I pulled on a raincoat and dashed outside, determined to protect my more fragile plants. I spent a frantic half-hour staking saplings and covering the seedlings with tarps. The dwarf banana plants seemed to flap wildly in the gale, as if trying to take flight. By the time I finished, water dripped from every inch of my coat, and the yard looked like a soggy jungle war zone. Yet in an odd way, the storm felt cleansing. It tested the mettle of my growing oasis, forcing roots to dig deeper and leaves to brace against the elements. The morning after, sunlight returned, revealing a few battered leaves but no catastrophic losses. The ferns perked up once they dried out, and the canna lilies, a bit droopy at first, soon stood tall again. I took the small victory as a sign. If my fledgling jungle could survive a tumultuous storm, it might endure whatever the HOA threw at me next. Sure enough, Jerry Holcomb didn't disappoint. Later that week, I received a crisp, certified letter titled Final Warning, HOA Inspection Imminent. It informed me that a representative of the association would conduct a visual inspection of my property to verify compliance or noncompliance with community standards. The date was set 3 days from now. They'd come unannounced, presumably to catch me off guard. That put a sour taste in my mouth. It felt invasive, like I was a delinquent child being monitored. But it also steeled my resolve. I spent the next 2 days tidying up the jungle, removing weeds, pruning dead foliage, and strategically placing pavers to create a neat, walkable path through the greenery. If they were going to show up and assess my yard, they'd see it in its best possible condition. I even went so far as to place small signs labeling the plants, partly to emphasize their intentional, cultivated nature. Hibiscus rosasinensis, one sign read, "Native to warmer climates, carefully adapted for Sunnyvale conditions." On the third day, right around noon, a silver sedan rolled up. No HOA logos or anything of the sort, just plain plates. A tall, wiry man in a polo shirt emerged. He introduced himself as Carl, the association's property compliance officer. With a clipboard in hand, he strolled up my walkway, barely giving me a glance. Instead, he started jotting notes, pacing back and forth across the front yard as if he were a detective looking for clues. I leaned against my porch railing, forcing a smile. "Anything I can help you with?" Carl looked up from his notes, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. Per the directive, I'm examining the extent of tree trimming and any unapproved modifications to the landscaping. He eyed the banana plants and the thick carpet of ferns. "These are unusual choices for our community, don't you think?" I shrugged. "They're not on any prohibited list. I've checked. No invasive species, no unsafe conditions. I keep them well maintained, as you can see." He grunted and continued inspecting, tapping branches and looking up at the oak canopy. Finally, he wandered back to his car, finished scribbling notes without even a goodbye. I figured I'd get a letter soon detailing his findings. In the meantime, I decided to rally some help. I'd heard rumors about a local horticultural club that met once a month at the public library, folks who specialized in eco-friendly projects and might sympathize with my predicament. After a few inquiries, I showed up at their next meeting. The group's membership skewed older, with plenty of men and women in their 60s and 70s wearing straw hats or sporting well-used gardening gloves. Perfect. At the end of their gathering, I raised my hand and introduced myself. I explained how the HOA wanted me to whittle down 2 ancient oaks and clamp down on my exotic plants, all in the name of aesthetic conformity. A murmur of disapproval rippled through the group. One man, Mr. Evans, stood up and said that trees with historical significance in the county were sometimes eligible for a protective status. Another woman, Harriet, pointed out she'd once faced a similar threat from an HOA over her pollinator-friendly garden. She challenged them in small claims court and won a partial victory. After the meeting, a few members lingered to chat with me. They offered to write letters on my behalf, testifying that my landscaping added ecological value and was carefully curated. Harriet even volunteered to help me contact an environmental lawyer she'd used before. I shook their hands, touched by the generosity of strangers who recognized the importance of preserving living things rather than bowing to bureaucratic whims. That night, I realized that though my original motive was rebellious defiance, the situation had grown bigger than me alone. These plants, these old oaks, carried a significance beyond my personal memories. They represented a stand against the slow creep of uniformity that threatened to smother individuality in places like Sunnyvale Estates. I could practically hear Clara saying, "Fight for what you believe in, but do it with heart." Sure enough, another letter from the HOA arrived a few days later. The compliance officer's report stated that while I had conducted minimal trimming of the oaks, the extensive addition of exotic plant species was unaligned with the subdivision's visual consistency. They warned that further review might lead to fines or forced removal of non-compliant flora. My heart pounded as I read those words. I picture them hauling off my banana plants or bulldozing my beloved ferns. Anger flared, but so did determination. I carefully saved every piece of documentation and filed it in a binder labeled "OA Defense." I printed out the horticultural club's statements, the environmental lawyer's contact info, and any evidence showing how I was following all the standard guidelines regarding safety and maintenance. If the board planned to escalate, I'd meet them on the battlefield, armed not with pruners, but with knowledge, community support, and the unwavering belief that nature deserves a chance to grow. It all came to a head at the next HOA General Assembly. These meetings were typically small affairs, held in the stuffy clubhouse adjacent to the community's pool area. But word spread that my so-called jungle fiasco was on the agenda, and curiosity drew a larger crowd than usual. I arrived early, wearing a clean-collared shirt and holding my thick binder of documents. Jerry Holcomb stood at the front of the room, tapping a microphone to get people's attention. In the front row sat the board members, along with a couple of folks from the county's horticultural department, thanks to Harriet's connections, I presumed. Some neighbors I recognized from casual hellos were scattered throughout the chairs, along with a surprising number of new faces. Perhaps half the room was in their 50s or older. The others were middle-aged couples or adult children attending on behalf of their parents. The hum of conversation was lively. Jerry called the meeting to order and ran through the usual updates, repainting the neighborhood sign, scheduling next year's summer picnic, mundane bits that no one truly cared about. At last, he reached the line item. enforcement of landscaping standards in relation to overgrown trees and exotic plants. He cleared his throat. It has come to the board's attention that homeowner Mr. Gray's yard has significantly altered the look of our neighborhood and may pose concerns. He started rattling off a list of potential issues: mosquito breeding unfounded, I kept my yard meticulously drained, risk of fallen branches, the oak had passed an arborist's inspection with flying colors, and negative impact on property values, no data presented, of course. Then he called me up to present my defense. The way he said it, you'd think I was on trial for grand theft. I walked to the podium, my knees feeling a bit wobbly. This wasn't my usual style. Clara had always been the eloquent one. But I took a breath and reminded myself of why I was there. I'm here today, I began, voice trembling slightly, to stand up for two majestic trees older than any house in Sunnyvale, and for the plants I've introduced that are, in fact, fully legal and responsibly maintained. I lifted my binder and flipped through a few pages, showing the board that I complied with the state's guidelines, as well as the fact that no law or HOA bylaw explicitly forbade the introduction of certain exotic species, only invasive or noxious plants, which I had not used. I also presented a short letter from the Horticultural Club praising the ecological diversity my yard provided, flowers that attracted pollinators, shade for small critters, and a healthy canopy that helped reduce water runoff. People in the audience nodded, some murmuring approval. I spotted Harriet giving me a thumbs up and Mr. Evans tipping his hat. The tension was thick, though, because Jerry Holcomb was visibly unimpressed. Once I concluded, he took the microphone and suggested a formal vote among the board members to decide whether my yard constituted a nuisance. At that moment, an older woman in the crowd rose and asked to speak. She introduced herself as Shirley Patterson, a Sunnyvale resident for 30 years. She revealed how she'd lost her husband last year and how seeing my vibrant yard, bursting with life, reminded her that time marches on, but beauty can still thrive around us. She said it lifted her spirits each morning when she passed by, offering a glimpse of something hopeful. Her words caught me off guard. I felt my throat tighten. I'd never spoken to Shirley Patterson beyond a polite wave. Yet here she was, courageously telling the board that my yard brought her joy. Another man stood recounting how, in another part of the country, a similar dispute ended with the community rallying around a homeowner's efforts to preserve old-growth trees. Voices began echoing around the room. Some spoke of the need for uniformity, yes, but many expressed a yearning for more individuality, for pockets of greenery that broke the monotony of manicured lawns. Jerry fidgeted. He was losing the room. Still, he forced a vote among the board, each member raising a hand for or against declaring my yard a nuisance. To my astonishment, it split evenly 2-2. As president, Jerry technically had the tiebreaker. Yet in a move that surprised everyone, one board member who had initially been leaning Jerry's way abstained at the last second, stating that further review and dialogue was necessary before any drastic actions. The motion died. Applause erupted, and a gavel banged as Jerry attempted to restore order. Flustered, he announced that the board would convene another session later to re-examine the bylaws regarding landscaping freedom. For now, no fines would be imposed, and no forced trimming would occur beyond routine safety measures. I was free to keep my oaks unscathed, my vines uncut, and my banana plants flourishing. Relief washed over me. Neighbors congratulated me as we filed out of the clubhouse. Shirley Patterson gave my hand a gentle squeeze, tears in her eyes. Harriet from the Horticultural Club whispered, "This is just the beginning. Keep building on what you've started." Mr. Evans winked and said he'd help me petition for historical tree protection status if I wanted. Later that evening, after the adrenaline died down, I sat quietly on a wooden bench under my oaks. The night air was mild, the leaves rustling above like a lullaby. I looked around at the cluster of exotic greens, the wide banana leaves shimmering in the moonlight, the ferns leaning toward the damp earth. The small solar-powered lights I'd installed cast a soft glow, revealing the subtle interplay of shapes in the foliage. For a brief moment, I thought of Clara, her gentle laugh, the way her hair caught the sunlight when she read beneath these very branches. I felt a pang of sorrow that she wasn't here to see this moment of triumph, but I also believed she'd be proud. Because in standing up for these trees, I discovered that I, too, could still stand tall, even after heartbreak and loss. And so my suburban jungle remains. It's not about defying rules for the sake of rebellion alone, but rather about nurturing life in the face of mindless uniformity. Sometimes, especially in a community that prizes similarity, an old oak or a banana plant can be a spark that reminds us we're all living, growing beings, filled with stories, shaped by time, worthy of respect, and a place to flourish. Whether the HOA changes its rules entirely or not, I rest easy these days. I water my plants in the early mornings, watch the cardinals and hummingbirds flit among the blossoms, and take quiet pride in knowing that, for now at least, nature's vibrant tapestry won out over bureaucratic scissors. I can almost hear the oaks sigh in relief, their branches swaying in subtle applause, as if to say, "Thank you for letting us stay alive and free."